Joe White, Director of the Center for Policy Studies here at Case Western Reserve University. I'd like to welcome you all to one of our Biskin Global Comments lectures on international affairs. Our speaker today is Dr. Julia C. Strauss, a senior lecturer in Chinese politics at the School of Oriental and African Studies of the University of London. Dr. Strauss, I must admit, was one of my friends and classmates in graduate school at Berkeley. And she has always been one of the most interesting and deep and broad scholars I've known since I first met her. She spent 9 years being the editor of the China Quarterly, which I can hardly imagine anything that would give you a broader overview of the topic of Chinese politics than serving as editor of that journal. And in the course of that, they did a project on China and Africa and those relationships, and published a book, a special journal issue, and a book out of that. They have now just done a special journal issue on China's relationships with Latin America. I don't think it is exactly out yet, but it should be out in like a day or two or something, because it's the March issue. But she's not the editor anymore, so if it's a little late, then
I can't be blamed.
Right, she can't be blamed. At any rate, she is one of the participants in this special journal issue on the relationship between China and Latin America. And one of the things that she works on a lot is how the Chinese elites see what they're doing. Framing, claiming, naming, shaming, blaming, whatever the words are that the people who study political psychology would use. And her talk today is going to be on this question of how the Chinese see their engagement in Latin America. And with that, I should be quiet and turn it over to Dr. Strauss.
Thank you very much, Joe. When one comes to these things, one always has a mixed audience. Some people who have the Chinese, some people who have the Spanish and the Portuguese, some people who have other ends. So the reason why the Chinese characters are up there, 走出去, is just to indicate that actually I do know something at least about the Chinese part of this. And I've come to learn a great deal about the Latin American part of this very large set of questions in terms of China and its going out policy more generally, and then in particular with respect to these two world areas. Africa, where China's presence has been very much a reemergence and revival of a relationship from the 1950s and 1960s that was deeply ideologically framed, and a much, much newer one in Latin America, which is devoid of some of the old rhetoric, but very much takes up and is part of a larger globalized rhetoric. I'm also going to say, wherever I can, something about the China-Latin America relationship in general, because this is such a new topic that, in honesty, people don't know all that much about it. And we frankly, when we were putting together the volume, didn't know all that much about it, but we did manage to put together a group of very, very good people. If you have access to the Cambridge University Press journals online through, I think, this university or most major universities will have this, where literally if you go onto, if you type in China Quarterly, it ought to come straight up. And literally it should be out, the journal version of this special issue should be out literally any minute now, like today or tomorrow. The book version, over the weekend actually, I was doing a little bit of extra work to kind of iron out some of the little copy editing mistakes that weren't quite dealt with, but that should be available in time for LASA, for the big Latin American Studies Conference as well, if you're in the world of Latin America and might be going to that. Let me start off with how the Chinese and Chinese elites, and indeed Latin American elites, for the most part, like to imagine and see their burgeoning interaction. It looks something like this, minus the power line. For the book version, we've managed, at Cambridge University Press had very good people that we got on the case to airbrush out the power line. This is a mural on the side of a primary school in Mexicali, Mexico, that happens to have an unusually large number of Chinese immigrant children, part of the now burgeoning and largely undocumented, I might add, overseas Chinese community in Mexico. When we think about this question of China and Latin America, we're really confronted by enormous changes in the past decade. 10 years ago, you couldn't even really talk about China and Latin America because quite literally there was almost nothing to speak of. And in literally the space of 10 years, China has become highly visible from a base of virtually zero in Latin America. Let me just, I'm not a big fan of charts. I like pictures, but not charts. So let me just give you some of this in text. China, in the last 2 years, became the largest trade partner of Brazil, the largest economy, the largest state, the economically dominant power, if you will, in Latin America, and displacing the United States. This happened in Chile, I think, about 4 years ago. Where China became the largest trade partner of Chile. I think this is about 4 years ago. It is now the second largest trading partner of Peru and Uruguay. It is the fourth largest trading partner, even of a country like Argentina, which historically has had very close trade relationships with the EU, to a lesser extent the United States. Historically, very strong trading relationships between Argentina and European Union countries. In addition, in just the last couple of years, a huge number of major contracts have been signed and major deals have broken ground. These have ranged from port infrastructure, the most famous of which is the Atru port, which literally was a hole in the ground. It was nothing before this deal went through. In Brazil, why? Well, because there's so much trade now between Brazil and China that there really needs to be a bigger port capable of handling all the traffic. There is ongoing discussion of a major port in Ecuador that has not quite worked out. There was major talk of this 2 years ago. And there's ongoing discussion of any number of infrastructure projects either utilizing the Panama Canal or indeed even bypassing the Panama Canal. There are huge oil deals that are signed seemingly every 6 months, particularly with Venezuela. There are huge copper deals ongoing in Chile and Peru. And that's just the major, big, splashy deals that are signed. There's a much larger amount of what I would colloquially call middling to everyday trade in pursuit of profit. These don't get the kind of headlines that the big deals get, but from virtually all of Argentina's trade, for example. If China has become the fourth largest trade partner of Argentina, and virtually all of it involves the soybeans. All of it involves soya. So this ranges from agricultural products, particularly soy, in Argentina and Brazil. Chinese businesses beginning to take stakes in Latin American businesses. Quite literally, just last month, a bank called China Industrial and Commercial Bank has just taken an 80% share in the Standard Bank of Argentina. I know nothing about the Standard Bank of Argentina and therefore no way of gauging whether this was a wise investment or a rather shaky investment, but nevertheless, quite instructive. Chinese traders, often small, local, family firms, sometimes peddlers, sometimes small employing firms, are everywhere in Latin America now. They are a particular presence and a particular source of irritation in Mexico. And that's just the everyday stuff. But I think it's important to sort of step back from what is an increasingly busy, cluttered, complicated picture on the ground in Latin America. To take a step back and to see that, in fact, China's involvement in Latin America is but one facet of a much larger set of policies of going global, 走出去. China and Latin America is part of this much more general state-sanctioned push for both state businesses and private businesses, and the large range of businesses that are neither entirely state nor entirely private, but are rather something amorphous in between these two categories in China, to go out and seek profit in the developing world. This push is happening everywhere in the developing world, and it is experienced differently in different parts of the developing world, with, I would say broadly, a continuum. The oldest, longest standing, and biggest push, in fact, is in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is the closest geographically to China. Many Southeast Asian countries share borders with China, and therefore it's relatively easy to get back and forth, particularly after Chinese companies build the roads to link these places. And there are, in most of Southeast Asia, there are very, very large Chinese overseas communities, many of which actually have positions of real influence in trading and in local economies. In Africa, we have, in fact, a revival on slightly, but only slightly different terms, of an older, quite ideologically framed relationship that started off with Mao and the people around Mao claiming to offer a different model of development for Africa that was qualitatively different as well as better from that of the West. So there's a whole set of basic principles about aid, about development, about living close to the people, and basically instructing and training Africans to find their own way to development, as long as it more or less replicated a Maoist way of self-reliance and, application of heroism to unbelievable challenges like constructing railways across Tanzania and Zambia, with railways really had no business being, given the terrain and so forth, and so on. Then we have Latin America now, and I would suggest, in complete ignorance of what in fact is going on between China and the Middle East, that China, from the state on down, state actors, the state itself, official representation, state actors, quasi-state companies and private companies are given strict instructions, actually, I suspect, to tread very, very carefully and very, very lightly in the Middle East, given how difficult political circumstances often are in the Middle East. Now, China claims to be good as it goes out in the world. And you get two kind of oscillating frames, if you will, of how good we are from a Chinese perspective. One that I don't even have down here is, because it doesn't apply very much to the case of Latin America, suggests is a direct inheritance from the Maoist past. We are good because we're a developing country too. We don't exploit you. We will never colonize you. We come when we're invited. We don't interfere in your internal affairs. And we try to help you figure out what's best for you in the light of your own circumstances, and we'll never keep you in an economically dependent system of international trade and so forth, and we'll never look down on you, quite unlike both the investment and trading regime, investment and trade, and also NGO and aid regimes of the West. So we are like you, we understand you, and this fundamental rhetoric replicates itself on a notion of what I call fractal replication, of similarity. We've developed here, we're going to help you develop there in your own way, but basically using our model independently. There's very little sense of trade. There's no sense at all about complementarity. There's zero sense of division of labor. Since the 1990s, another framing developmental rhetoric has come in and has come to dominate China's discussion of what China itself is doing in the developing world and in world trade more generally. We are maximizing comparative advantage. We are all playing different parts in a globalized unitary system of complementarity, win-win, everyone pursuing their own individual self-interest, but ultimately everybody being better off for having specialized in a global economy. So there are these are two very, very different notions. In Africa, to this day, China's rhetoric kind of oscillates back and forth very uneasily between the two. The older Mao era rhetoric that is fractal and that is based on replication and similarity, and every nation finding its own path to development, but basically replicating the experience in their own way over and over and over again. The 1990s and after the 1990s rhetoric is very, very different. It's about comparative advantage. It's about a world economic order and the pursuit of individual self-interest on the basis of what is different and complementary. However, there are several things that have remained the same throughout, from literally Mao in the 60s up to the present day in this rhetoric. First, we are a positive force. We're the good guys because we don't seek hegemony, and the implicit target here is the United States. It used to also be the Soviet Union, but now it's basically the United States. We don't seek hegemony. We understand developing countries because we have been one for so long, and we still are one. China is still very reluctant to give up on its self-identification as a developing country, which actually sounds fairly unsustainable, given the differences in influence and scale and so on in actual bilateral relationships. We'll get to that a little later. We're good because we don't attach political conditions of any kind to developing countries, again, implicitly unlike that hypocritical West that every 10 years they come up with a new aid regime, all kinds of unreasonable neo-colonial conditions that are interfering in your domestic affairs. We don't, in fact, we don't have political conditions of any kind other than insisting on a one China policy. We operate on the basis of mutual benefit and profit. So we have differences from the earlier period, the earlier Maoist period. But we also have some things that are the same. There is still an implicit claim to be separate, to do things differently than the hegemonic West, and implicitly to do things not only differently, but better. We are all developing countries. We all understand each other. The difference now is that we understand each other in a neoliberal global context where the rules of the game are really very different. Now, there is a real spectrum of Latin American views and positions on what my colleague and co-editor Ariel Armani, who's at the University of Miami now, calls the desembarco. For example, Chilean and Peruvian governments, as well as business elites, have fully and consistently embraced the neoliberal order. Specialization, complementarity, supply and demand. The Chilean and Peruvian economies are also heavily based on export of primary commodities, particularly mining. And then in the last 10 years or so, in particular, 5 in particular, they've been very, very advantaged by the worldwide boom in mineral prices that has, of course, largely been, not exclusively, but largely come about because of China's demand for raw materials as it in its own construction and manufacturing industries. So what you find is that Chilean and Peruvian, the one I've studied is the Peruvian governments and business elites, are only too happy to reify this rhetoric of win-win, complementarity, this being good for everybody. In fact, it's really quite funny. If you look at the transcripts of meetings held between Peruvian presidents and vice presidents and Chinese leaders, because what you see is this absolute perfect mimicking of these buzzwords about complementarity and win-win and so forth and so on, that well, let's just put it this way. Many of the indigenous Peruvians actually living in these mining areas actually quibble with a good deal. All right, so we have, but at the government and elite level in Chile and Peru, as just one for example, to give you one sense of what the outliers are in terms of the support for this. In Chile and Peru, governments and business elites, very, very pro-China to the extent of having, in effect, swallowed this rhetoric, hook, line, and sinker. Now, at the other opposite extreme, we have the Mexican government, as well as Mexican businesses, and popular perceptions in Mexico that are very critical of China. They are hot because, of course, Mexico, the Mexican economy is highly competitive with China. They're operating very, very similar manufacturing niches. They both depend very heavily, Mexico more than China, on export markets, particularly to the United States. And to not put too fine a point on it, the Mexican economy and strategy of economic growth has lost enormous, enormous market share to the Chinese in the last 5 to 10 years, particularly in Canada and the United States. And therefore, and in addition to that's sort of bad enough, but there is at least the perception that the Chinese are not playing by a fair set of rules, they're engaging in dumping, and that there's an uncontained flood of largely undocumented Chinese small businesses and hawkers that in effect are taking or are driving the local economy, particularly in things like apparel, shoes, toys, and so forth, totally out of business. Indeed, in Mexico City, there is one little part of town, there's a downtown bit of Mexico City that in effect has been driven out of business because a bunch of Chinese traders have set up their stalls in a sort of warehouse sort of thing, where the slogan is, clothe yourself for 100 pesos a day. And basically you can go in and the clothing is so cheap and it's been smuggled in and so forth and so on, that it's driving regular retail out of business. So we have these two sort of extremes. And then, but in fact, I think it's fair to say that the Chilean and Peruvian governments and business elites lining up with the rhetoric, and for the most part, the Mexican government, businesses, and popular sentiment lining up on the negative side are unusual. It is much more typical that there is a mixed and ambivalent set of responses to what China means in terms of its engagement on the ground in Latin America. So in Brazil, for example, there is an interesting articulation of layered responses. In general, the government and ranges of governments, because in Brazil, the federal governments are actually quite strong. You have ranges of governments as well as business leaders being welcoming of big deals, welcoming of infrastructure, and guardedly welcoming, but also deeply, deeply concerned about what a group of economists in Brazil, in Sao Paulo, is calling the re-commodification of Brazilian patterns of trade. What does China want? That the trade is more or less balanced between Brazil and China, but most of what China wants from Brazil are minerals, raw materials, and soybeans, and most of what Brazil buys from China are finished goods and intermediary goods in manufacturing processes. But publics and sort of local traders aren't as upset as they are in, for example, Mexico, because the niche that Chinese exports to Brazil have taken has not been felt in consumer durables in nearly the same way that it has been in Mexico. So, and there's also deep, deep worry amongst a broad coalition of Brazilian policymakers and farmers about Chinese companies and so forth buying farms and buying land in Brazil. And indeed, the worries are so deep that most Brazilian states, to the best of my knowledge, have simply forbidden it and outlawed it, and it just can't happen. So we have a range of different responses in Brazil that are spread throughout different sectors and at different levels of government. In other countries, what one gets is a fairly clear split, which is reminiscent of Africa, where by and large, the government and top business elites tend to support China and China's activities, and middling people in business and people on the street either are worried or deeply ambivalent in that they want the cheap Chinese goods, but they also worry about local businesses being driven out of business. So in Argentina, we get something like this. We have the upper echelons of government and the upper echelons of business on the whole being very welcoming of this new set of relationships, which basically means soy and to a lesser extent beef and things like this. But there are perennially points of flash tension over China's presumed dumping of manufactured exports. And in fact, China has actually pushed its weight around a little bit with Argentina of late, in effect saying, well, if you don't like it, we'll cancel our orders for all of the soy that is making us your fourth largest trade partner. Okay, so there's a range of different perceptions, sometimes by country, sometimes by sector. And this is, in fact, a chronic theme in any kind of general consideration of China and Latin America. There are profound issues of what I call misperception and steep learning curves. And so what are the kind of sources of this misperception and sort of separating out the rhetoric and the reality? Okay. First, there is a sort of sleight of hand whereby China and Latin America are referred to all the time as if they're unitary constructs. And of course they're not. Now it's a little easier for everyone to get that Latin America isn't a unitary construct, because after all, there's more than one country in Latin America. And in fact, there's a great deal of diversity in Latin America, and because they're different countries, this is sort of analytically easy to grasp. However, China is one country, and the Chinese rhetoric presents itself as one country. And and this self-presentation as a unitary state, moreover, that knows what's going on, in some ways does China a disservice, because people think of Chinese businesses as being the same as the Chinese state. Now, the problem here is that there are many different layers of intertwining between China as a state and Chinese businesses, which range from state-owned enterprises that have the ear of the state council and who, by any measure, really are part of the state, to less provincial and county and sometimes municipal businesses that have differential levels of involvement and support from state actors, to all the way down to the individual family or the individual guy who migrates, because there's no work in China, who migrates overseas in search of business opportunities and trading opportunities, who has no state support whatsoever. So it's not very easy a lot of the time. It's very easy to take the construct of China and to assume that because state and business are intertwined in China, that they are the same thing. But in fact, most of the time, they're not the same thing, or they're only variably the same thing. China is absolutely riven with principal-agent problems. In addition, in terms of, yeah, you have a state enterprise, or you have an enterprise that's won a state contract, but in fact, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or even the Ministry of Commerce and Foreign Trade, doesn't necessarily have great control over what that company happens to be doing. And if the company is well run and, quote, sensitive to local conditions, you're fine. And if it's not, as is the case with Zhejiang and other companies in the copper mining sector in Peru, you've got a really, really big problem, public relations and otherwise. In addition, but this misperception also runs the other way around. Latin American countries are very different from each other, and they often, even typically, present quite unfamiliar political and cultural environments for Chinese businesses and even for parts of the Chinese state that you would hope would know better. But there's a profound knowledge gap. There's a profound lack of knowledge. And so, for example, to generalize grossly, some of the features that are quite typical of states in Latin America, strong or noisy labor unions, a certain amount of drama surrounding elections, populist appeals being made by politicians, presses that take very different party lines and are very vigorous in their criticism, and a whole range of protests. The list goes on and on. Chinese companies, by and large, aren't used to dealing with this kind of thing. And so what is simply normally the way state society patterns are worked out in Latin America is something that many Chinese actors are simply unprepared for, and even if they are unprepared, look upon this kind of thing with a great deal of distaste because it is, quote, chaos. It is, quote, unstable. And one of the many lingering effects of Chinese political culture that goes back a long way, a legacy of political division and foreign invasion for the first half of the 20th century, and then buttressed by the 10 years of the Cultural Revolution. Everyone in China is agreed, we don't like chaos very much. Anything that gets anywhere near chaos is just a bad thing. Okay, so when we think of the rhetoric of functional division of labor in a globalized economy, win-win, mutual benefit, win-win, and it does work under some circumstances. In fact, it may even work well under most circumstances. But unfortunately, this bland rhetoric really kind of begs the question of who wins, under what circumstances, for how long, and with what other effects, environmental, social, and otherwise. And so here we get into a set of claims and counterclaims on the part of people who in Latin America, or for that matter, in North America, who are skeptical or suspicious of what it is, the range of things that China is engaged with in Latin America. And I think that these can be broadly grouped by questions of scale, questions of sector, and deep worries about asymmetry. Okay, we got a scale problem here. China is simply much, much larger than the states of Latin America, with the single exception of Brazil, whom I might add, although I don't have it up here, it does treat differently. Brazil is big and important. It's got a lot of natural resources. It has been included in a different global rhetoric of rising BRICS, and so has to be taken seriously on those grounds. Brazil is different, and Brazil may or may not be pointing the way to the emergence, to the development and the emergence of a slightly new rhetoric. It may not. We'll get to that in a moment. But the fact of the matter remains that for all of the states in Latin America, including Brazil, China is a much more important trade partner to countries in Latin America than the other way around. So China looms very, very large for, say, Chile and Peru. But Chile and Peruvian foreign trade and exports to China are a tiny, tiny, teeny, weeny fraction of China's overall global trade. And this makes some people a little nervous. What may be good for some in terms of mining and extraction may actually be pretty bad for others. particularly indigenous groups, and it may be very bad for public goods, like the destruction of the Amazon, for example, particularly in local political environments in which whatever money it is being made, and there is quite a lot, is not being distributed in any kind of way that is reasonable and or socially just. Peruvian elites are all for this, and you can imagine why. They're the ones making all the money and paying very little of the costs for the bad behavior of some of China's mining companies in Peru. All right, let me move on. Now, what this can translate to on the part of perceptions and criticisms coming from Latin America is a whole set of elite sensitivities about economic colonialism, or what is called, or what more properly is called, a set of trade and other relationships that are asymmetrical enough that people are worried about the emergence of dependency, economic colonialism, and so forth. Now, this worry completely shocks and stuns the Chinese government because, of course, and business elites, because their entire reason for being and justification to themselves as well as to the outside world is that this is all predicated on doing good and not being colonial, and distinguishing themselves historically from the West and not being colonial. So there is a kind of gap there with certain kinds of criticism and the sort of blank, incomprehending, and probably deeply offended response to the response on the part of the Chinese government. There are, may very well be Latin American local sensitivities about the way in which their own governments and businesses have concluded what they understand to be unfair arrangements that despoil local environments and livelihoods. It's very easy to point to a couple of particularly dreadful cases of bad Chinese mining companies that were very unprepared and have very bad management in Peru. But this can translate to other environments as well, where the costs and benefits are not as stark and things are a bit muddier. For example, in Brazil for sure, and this may be true in Argentina as well, where soy is a huge export. Even in local agricultural and communities, there are divisions about how to understand and accept and negotiate and renegotiate and so forth the Chinese presence in these wider patterns of trade, because of course China is good because it pushes up the prices for soy as a raw commodity. On the other hand, the imperative to produce much more cheaply is having a whole set of knock-on effects in terms of local sustainability, soil fragility, application of yicky fertilizers, which then run off and they despoil the local streams and so forth and so on. So there are, even within agricultural communities, there may very well be mixed and ambivalent responses. What seems to be a good may only be a partial good. A good, but only partial. So there are a whole range of different sets of layers and local sensitivities. What I would say is that there is a good deal sorry, presently ongoing in terms of soft power and learning. Mexico, at every level, from the government down to the trader on the street, has tended to be very, very critical of what is perceived as a Chinese invasion. However, it is also clear that different local governments in Mexico may be dealing and learning to deal with the Chinese presence quite differently. So, in Mexico City, you've got a pushback response of vilification and violent targeting of Chinese businesses with, rocks being thrown, through windows on a regular basis. However, Tijuana and Mexicali, as local municipal business environments, have just in the last 2 or so years started to deal with this with the Chinese, quote, invasion very differently. They've started to reach out to local Chinese business communities, largely because there tends to be 1 or 2 key Chinese-Mexican businessmen who want to build these kinds of bridges between local communities and Chinese business and Chinese trade and a whole set of globalized opportunities. And the response so far on the part of a range of business associations and support from the local government and local chambers of commerce and so forth in Mexicali and Tijuana has been to actually try to integrate and formalize what it is that the Chinese immigrants are doing anyway, and to be more welcoming, accommodating, and try to figure out ways of using this immigration and what in Mexico City is simply being perceived as an invasion that we hate and that we want to get rid of and we want it to go away. So there may very well be a learning process, maybe not necessarily at the level of top government or the big deals, but throughout many layers of government and with many different kinds of actors. I'm going to end with this very nice-looking mural, which is on the side of a school in Mexicali that has a much larger than average number of Chinese/Chinese-Mexican, overseas Chinese children in the school, as being the image of that both China and most governments in Latin America want to propagate. We have equality. We've got the Great Wall running around. We've got children reaching hands out. We've got all sorts of good things based on equality and cultural connection across, quite literally, this kind of divide. The rhetoric so far does not really match the reality in many, many situations in China and Latin America. And since my own focus is rhetoric and what it is that the Chinese government elites think it is that they're doing and then how they justify it to themselves and to everyone else, I'd like to leave you with a little straw in the wind about how rhetoric may or may not be changing overall in terms of this particular China-Latin America relationship, and who knows, perhaps in China's going out more generally. In just the last year and a half, there was a meeting on China and Brazil held in Beijing where people, okay, they were academics, you don't necessarily always listen to them, but they were reported on enough so that I could, find the proceedings. It was reported on and I could find evidence of this without having to leave my computer in London. And at this conference in Beijing, the headline was quite literally, going beyond win-win. Finding a new locomotive for interaction and growth that was tentatively being called common development, 共同发展, which is really quite different than mutual benefit, with its connotations of difference, globalized, having a niche in a globalized economy. Common development begins to hint at the kinds of things that the Chinese government, at a quite elite level, is beginning to encourage in its relations, at least with Brazil. For example, they have set up a separate steering committee with a long acronym basically between government leaders and business leaders to try to anticipate problems as a kind of informal kitchen cabinet and steering committee for resolving problems. One of the key problems being the unbalanced nature of trade between the two parties. It's more or less in balance, but it isn't balanced by sector. So China ships manufactured goods. Basically, Brazil ships commodities of various kinds. And this committee is actually having an impact quite visibly, because now there's a lot more publicity about Brazilian stuff being sold in China, as just a for example. And so it is unclear whether the Chinese government is giving Brazil special consideration because of its scale, because of its importance, because it's a BRIC. I mean, there are any number of reasons why this could be true. But this notion of 共同发展 begins to get, or common development, begins to get at what the Chinese rhetoric has always claimed: equality, a relative equality, a real equality, a substantive equality, not just a formal one, between sovereign states. It remains to be seen whether notions of common development will progress further in Brazil or get any purchase at all outside of Brazil. But it does, in its own way, indicate a kind of learning, as well as perhaps soft power. And so maybe more of Latin America and China will, in the coming years, begin to look like this. Thank you. I didn't go on for too long, did I? No.
Thank you very much, Dr. Strauss. Now it's time for questions and comments. We'll circulate the microphone around to people so that we can record. There's a lot.
Hi, thank you for a wonderful presentation. And while I was listening, I couldn't help thinking about the United States.
Oh, yes.
And the history of U.S.-Latin American relations, and how much what you described seems that it's built on a relationship that was already created between the U.S. and Latin America, how much China is building on patterns that were already there. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I mean, and even the last part when you end, I was thinking, well, this looks just like the Alliance for Progress. Mm-hmm. And the reaction to an instability or protest against certain type of economic relations, which is happening right now in Latin America against mining and all the environmental movements and all the things. But not just that, I was thinking, you know, Chile, yes, of course they're going to have that attitude. It comes from the Chicago school and the Chicago boys and the dictatorship.
Who run the country, yes.
And Mexico, of course, is going to have that. That comes from a very different relationship with the United States and the Mexican Revolution. And fair trade, of course, that's also set for a relationship between the United States and Latin America. It's a language that's already there. So, and the fear of commodification is also fear that comes from that relationship. Mm-hmm. So, well, I'm so surprised of how much is built of maybe an empire replacing another, I don't know, but definitely on a language that is already there. And I wonder if there is any consciousness of that, mm-hmm. part of the Chinese government or elites, or not. Mm-hmm. I'm sure in part of the Latin Americans, they can see it. I mean, mm-hmm. it's surprising.
Well, in fact, we have, in the volume that will be coming out any hour now, we actually have an essay on not exactly this very related set of questions. Gonzalo Paz writes on hegemonic challenges in Latin America. And I wasn't able to make a lot of it in this presentation, but the introduction that Ariel Armani and I wrote looks at this notion of desembarco, where you have these different outsiders and outside powers crudely coming to Latin America and establishing the terms, or attempting to establish the terms of trade, of extraction, of political institution, of whatever. There seems to be, and this China very, very much fits into a lot of these patterns. You know, Europeans, Americans, Japanese in the 1980s, and now the Chinese. What I would suggest is that the Chinese have no awareness whatsoever of this, that they're building on this sort of deep none. Bleh. But what they are, in security terms, is very, very aware that their historical presence in Latin America is very shallow for reasons having to do with American U.S. dominance and, for lack of a better term, hegemony. So on the one hand, there's part of the rhetoric, this is so funny, there's part of the rhetoric that is reassuring, we're a developing country, just like you. We never engage in hegemonic activity. That's a load of nonsense, by the way, but this is how they set themselves. We never go overseas in search of, hegemony, political or otherwise. That's virtually a direct quote. And yet, if you pick up policy pieces and even the earliest generation of academic work published in Chinese on Latin America, you see a perfect replication of an old policy discourse from the United States, referring to Latin America as the United States' backyard. They have turned the word backyard into, well, it doesn't even exist in Chinese, but they call it Hou Yuan, which is literally a direct translation of back and yard. And you kind of think, what are they thinking? So there is a keen awareness of geostrategy and historical trajectory, and there is none whatsoever of the reasons why Peru and Chile are such receptive investment locales is because of the adoption of Chicago School. None, zero.
I think you are very keen to pick up the term that the common development. This is, I think, indeed is something new coming out of China.
About the last 18 months.
Let me give you my own personal example. I just recently advised the Chinese private businesses who just acquired a mine in Indonesia. It's a private business. This is young woman. This is not young woman, but they're in her late 40s. It was a newly rich billionaire who wanted to do something. As she said, she can't consume what she has earned so far. She wanted to do something. So she says, since the country needs resources, she is answering the call. So she went to Indonesia and bought this mine, and it has so happened Indonesia just changed his laws very fast. And but when she signed the contract, she was allowed to just mine it was a cobalt mine. Mine the earth. It was a red earth. It's a service mine. You can easily mine it and ship it up. Then, just as this mine begins its operation, then Indonesia changed the law saying that you cannot mine it and ship it up. You have to process it on the local. And it turned out, of course, it requires additional capital, which really present a challenge to this businesswoman. I mean, her name is Yang last name. And then she began to, initially using the old strategy of networking. She knew this Minister of Labor in the Indonesian government, and see if we get to her and see if she can go around this law. It turned out she met some difficulties. Then she came back and kind of lingered for a couple of months. And recently she was the representative to the MPC, which just ended last week. Right? At MPC, she told her project. And it turned out this government official, who was also the representative at the conference, is from the State Development Council. And he told Ms. Yang, saying that there's a new policy from the state. You can get the government loan to build factories in Indonesia because we wanted some kind of common development. We just did not want to get the mind out of it and you know, and be talked about by the whole world. So apparently, and she told me about this just last week, that she found the new capital and now she can build up factories there. So that's something I think you're right to pick it up.
It's very new though, and and we don't know exactly under what circumstances it will be meaningful.
Just a footnote.
Yeah, right.
In Peru and Chile, are Chinese allowed to buy into mining companies or into companies that support them?
They own mining companies.
Oh, they do.
Yeah.
You talk, as far as Argentina goes, you talk about Argentinians worried about Chinese dumping in Argentina. What is the product? Because I don't know what kind of industry Argentina has, but I don't think it's big. It's mainly, the main industry is agriculture.
Certainly the textiles, clothing, toys, finished items of daily use. Those are the things that I've seen referred to.
While I'm carrying this back, just in case, can you explain what BRIC means?
Oh, BRIC is, now it's BRICS. There's this notion of rising, what development economists have called, rising middle-income powers that, by reasons of scale and location, have had a disproportionate clout in their own regions, typically as regional powers as well as economic powers. So it started off with Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and it has recently, just in the last year, been extended to include South Africa.
Thank you for your presentation. My question has to do with human rights, and so much of the discourse about China and Africa has to do with human rights, and specifically oil transfers and military transfers in the Darfur region of Sudan. And I think that there's a similar rhetoric to try to say we have a common development and kind of make the situation look better than it is. But to human rights activists, it looks quite horrible on the ground. And I was wondering, when you look at Latin America, how you see the role of human rights being played out in some of these bilateral or trilateral relationships, and kind of what the human rights activists would say, or what the NGO community would say about the Chinese involvement, as opposed to what the Chinese or even the governments might say about themselves. Thanks.
Human rights is a tricky one because formally, very formally, the Chinese government subscribes to any number of different treaties about human rights. But on the other hand, it at the same time really adheres, at least in theory, to this notion of the state being an indivisible actor, a notion of pure sovereignty, and it predicates its entire foreign policy on non-interference in the domestic affairs of other countries. Well, most human rights issues and abuses kind of come across, run up against this other imperative. What I would say is that increasingly the developmental discourse, there are different strands in the developmental discourse, but as the developmental discourse becomes broader within China and within Chinese elites, for example, moving from a very narrow notion of development as comparative advantage in a globalized economy to something that's beginning to look a little more inclusive in terms of common development. That's not human rights exactly, but it can begin, but common development, if it takes off, could begin to include, and in fact in Brazil it has begun to include, notions of, a broader notion of livelihood. So I'm translating this back into a Chinese idiom. So the Chinese don't care that much about human rights. It's something that they signed up to because they kind of had to internationally. But domestically, they care deeply about norms of and the provision of what they call livelihoods. And insofar as you can show that locals, often, especially if they're of a different ethnicity, do not have a stake in the system and are not having an adequate livelihood provided, they're not seeing the benefits, there is at least a strain within that official discourse that is already set up to incorporate those concerns. Increasingly, in terms of environmental degradation, now different wings of the Chinese state, rather like different wings of states anywhere, vary dramatically in the degree of importance they put on things like environmental protection, but increasingly norms about biosphere preservation, biota reservoirs, and these kinds of things are increasingly important. At least I've begun to see some of this come into this rhetoric on Brazil. So Brazil is now often prefaced in general as being a very large landmass with the largest, with the largest reservoir of old-growth tropical forest and a precious world resource and reservoir for biosphere and biomass and these kinds of things. Now, is that human rights exactly? No, but it is beginning to come laterally, to cross-cut potentially at some of the same issues. The other thing that I would say about particularly the case of Sudan is that the Chinese leadership was in a very, very difficult position in Sudan because Sudan is such a pariah regime that nobody else wanted to deal with it. It was so awful. And so the Chinese in Africa, particularly in terms of oil concessions, not out of choice, the evidence is quite clear that they prefer to deal with much more stable environments than Sudan and Angola, but because all of the other good, more stable oil concessions were already locked up, they were sort of, places like Sudan and Angola was what was left. And in Sudan, Dan Large has written a great deal on Sudan. They have actually been quite adept in a way after being caught very flat-footed over international human rights activists in Darfur. It is quite clear that although it's never been publicly admitted, that the Chinese government put certain kinds of pressure on the government of Sudan, what's now sort of Sudan and North Sudan, to, if not clean up its act, then at least stop committing such egregious human rights abuses that were getting such a terrible international press for everybody. I think China's realism and willingness to be elastic with its principles actually is clearest in another Sudanese case, which is the government of South Sudan. It was quite clear that one of two things was going to happen before the referendum. Either the North would refuse to allow the referendum to happen, in which case there was going to be an outbreak of civil war again. Not very good in terms of stability, given that the oil is in the south, but it needs to go through to the north, because the ports in the north, that's not so great if what you need is oil and you like stable business environments. What the Chinese did was they made, as a matter of policy, a set of linkages and relationships with the opposition in South Sudan, and they went ahead and they set up what they called a consulate in Juba a year before independence happened, so that they were very, very well placed, sort of, they called it a consulate, but in all but name, it was an operating embassy in the South before the referendum. And so they could fairly neatly transition into recognition and so forth. So there is a certain deal of pragmatism because the Chinese government doesn't like it any more than any other government does when its nationals working on, oil rigs and pipelines are kidnapped, by opposition groups and so forth. It is in the Chinese government's interests to have as many local partners that they can get along with and linkages as possible. And if you read the Sudan policies in a slightly different way, you can actually see real stretching, if not snapping, of a lot of the principles that the Chinese government has proclaimed very loudly and very vigorously, all for, of course, largely for domestic reasons. The Chinese government is dead scared of what, if it sets that kind of precedent for involvement in other countries, what other countries are going to do with Xinjiang and Tibet, which seem to have some kind of claims that are absolutely denied, and where the human rights abuses are absolutely horrific. I mean, they're horrific.
Okay. To what extent is the resistance to the influx of Chinese businesses in Latin America the result of xenophobia, and to what extent is this resistance a product of resistance to corporate globalization and capitalism?
That's a very good question, and I think that in practice, it's very hard to disentangle these two things, these two elements. China's rhetoric and actions have, at least up until now in Latin America for the most part, stressed globalization and of a certain free market kind. Well, free market when it suits the government. It's not that free market because the Chinese government privileges its own players in all kinds of ways. How much of this is because of xenophobia? A lot of it is because of xenophobia in places like Mexico, but one has to wonder about the context of xenophobia. People don't wake up one fine day and decide, gee, I think I'll hate, the Chinese business down the street and throw a rock through its window. I mean, people don't do that for no reason. There's a particular kind of social context. I suspect that, at least in a Mexican context, it is not resistance to corporations and corporate globalization, because you don't see this kind of restiveness and the racial element against North American businesses in anything like the same way. And North American businesses have been encouraged to set up shop, full stop, in Mexico. So whatever resentments, reasonable resentments, Mexican workers and people on the street and so forth have of global corporatization and American influence, and it must exist. Why wouldn't it exist? It doesn't seem to play out in the same way. Now, the case of Mexico, I suspect, is as extreme as it is because there is a very, very broad alliance, a very, very broad cross-section of different layers and levels of state, business, and society that have a sort of knee-jerk negative reaction to China, because China causes worry for different reasons for different particular sectors. Some of it, the elites are worried, crudely, about loss of market share in a globalized economy. They're worried about the loss of the American market share in particular. But sort of to add insult to industry, insult to injury, there is the perception that Chinese traders and so forth are getting around the rules. They're bringing in tons of stuff. It's not being taxed. It's not being assessed. And in fact, there's a fair amount of evidence that, they're right. There are a lot of Chinese traders who are falsifying customs claims and bringing in containers of stuff and selling it dirt cheap and putting local businesses, out of business. The Chinese government also very, very seriously mishandled the SARS crisis. The Mexican government, when the SARS outbreak happened, came out immediately with public announcements. The Chinese government was slow and delayed, and it obfuscated, and it did this and it did that, and then it kind of publicly blamed Mexico. Well, that wasn't very well handled, and would be reason for any number of elites that, in the government anyway, educated elites to really think, who are these people? To not be, shall we say, predisposed. But Mexico is, I think, an extreme case because of this convergence of concern in different sectors. In other countries, it's much more ambiguous and layered and ambivalent.
Thank you very much for a fine talk. Am I on? But your talk concentrated almost exclusively on economic and commercial relationships between.
That's because that's where the action is.
Okay. But when China first got involved in the less developed world, in Africa, their projects almost all had a strategic dimension. The Tanzam Railway to move products so that Zambia didn't have to ship through Mozambique and South Africa. Arms to certain governments. Support for certain rebel movements. Is there a strategic dimension in today's Latin American-Chinese relations?
It depends on who you ask. It really depends on who you ask. There are people in the Defense Department and in intelligence organizations that are monitoring this very, very carefully. My own view is then there's a certain amount of worry about not exactly military shipments, but training exercises and certain kinds of equipment where they say that the equipment are for police and internal security, but you never really know. And the people in the CIA and other intelligence organizations are watching this very carefully. My own feeling is that whatever of that is going on, certainly the Chinese government is really downplaying security. Insofar as it talks about security, it talks about sort of human security. So it is perfectly fine with announcing that it's engaged with training programs for like disaster relief and disaster management, because these are countries with lots of earthquakes. Well, we have lots of earthquakes too. These are the ways that we deal with major, and so forth and so on. What I think most people are more worried about, and this is economic, but it also bleeds into being security. It is the possibility of a major Chinese project that will or might in some way bypass the Panama Canal. I do know that there are projects now being developed and floated, who knows whether they'll ever come to fruition, to build railway links across the top of South America so that the Panama Canal, which still supports the Panama Canal, the canal zone can be bypassed, and Panama, I believe, at least last week, was still one of the very, very, very few countries anywhere in the world, but in Latin America, who still recognize Taiwan, Republic of China, and Taiwan. So I think that the concerns, insofar as they're real, are a mix more, are likely to be a mix more of economics plus strategy with these sorts of things, rather than a re-emerging Cold War. At least officially, the Chinese government goes out of its way to state all of our relationships with Latin American countries. They go out of their way to reassure the United States. All we want to do is normalize them on the basis of mutual benefit. And at least officially, the official State Department response is we understand what China is doing, and we're not unduly concerned by this. We view this, we're basically taking the rhetoric at face value about this simply being a process of normalization of business and other ties. People in the defense community probably have a different view. How much reason there is for that view, I think, is simply not clear, nor probably can it be made objectively clear until and unless something really unexpected and awful happens. But I don't imagine that in any near term anything dramatic and awful from a defense perspective is likely to happen, because every single one of these countries, with the possible exception of Venezuela, which likes to sort of tweak the United States all the time. It's what they do. It's what this government likes to do as a way of making a certain set of claims and reaffirming its own support, and frankly, I think shoring up its own base in Venezuela. Well, the truth of the matter is that for all of the rhetoric, there are multiple continued linkages, private, public, business, and so forth, with all of these countries and the United States that are much deeper historically in terms of, for lack of a better term, trust, ways of doing business, and so forth and so on. And you see this reflected in press. Ariel has a very interesting article in this volume that looks at the open press in Colombia and sees that, by and large, there's a lot of interest, but also careful criticism of, the way Chinese do things, not just here, but maybe in their own country. And people in Latin America aren't stupid. China is a good thing, as if it provides an opportunity to make more money and to have you not be so dependent on the United States. This doesn't mean that it's a zero-sum game, and that Chinese influence of various sorts, if it rises, is necessarily diminishing that of the United States. I don't, at least at this stage, I don't see that that is happening, but I would defer to those of you who know more about Latin America than I on that question.
I'd just like to pose a question, just to follow up on this question about Mexico, and in general, the question of Chinese immigration to Latin America, which is not something we think of, or at least I didn't think of, as a major issue. And can you say something about the scale, whether it's something that is in more than Mexico, whether it's something that why it's really happening? Because, you made a comment about no jobs in China, but we keep hearing there's jobs in China. So what is the nature of the immigration? Why is it in Mexico, and so on? The
immigration is at different layers. There are big businesses that conduct big deals, and they bring over their expats. And you see that, for example, in the big mining companies, or in the development of the Achu port, or in any of the big infrastructure things. But this is happening all over the world. It's happening in Africa. It's happening in Southeast Asia. It's happening, all over the place. What I'm referring to, and I think where a lot of the sensitivities are where it's happening in individual families migrating and going out, in search of business opportunities and in search of making a better living. This is where you get, I think, a lot of the concern, because this is the point of contact with most local society. This is where many locals who are barely making it themselves see that they're being put out of business because their businesses are being undercut by Chinese clothes or whatever. I've read the most about this in Mexico, and it's on the order of probably 100,000. But we don't know because a lot of it's undocumented. We just don't know how much there is. Most of it, in fact, is undocumented. We know that there is some in Brazil, but the big East Asian community in Brazil is Japanese. We know that there is some in Peru. Exactly how much, I'm not clear. But we will certainly be seeing more of this, because every time there's an economic downturn and people get thrown out of work in China, or stable employment of various kinds disappears, there are going to be more families that sort of get with it. Now, when you look at patterns of Chinese migration, whether it's in Africa, whether it's in Mexico, whether it's, frankly, in the United States, where I'm from this year, there are whole cities that are Chinese, either Taiwanese or PRC. Mostly it's Taiwanese. But there's whole malls where all of the businesses are in Chinese. The Chinese is the language being spoken out in Newbury Park, and also down in Orange County. And it segments by occupation, it segments by class, it segments by Taiwan, and But there's a view that the Chinese immigrant is the Chinese immigrant, and in fact, the Chinese immigration is highly, highly segmented, and Chinese entrepreneurs and families prey on each other. There is no solidarity. They prey on each other much, much more than any external state or non-state actor in the host society preys on them. There is a ton of exploitation of Chinese by slightly earlier comers who have better connections and know how to get things done, et cetera, et cetera.
The country in South America which geographically absorbed Chinese is Argentina. They have a lot of empty spaces for them.
Well, the problem with empty spaces is that you get in, that's what Chinese think about Africa too. And it really doesn't work at all, because spaces that look like they're empty, in fact, are customarily owned by other people, even if they look like they're empty. And of course, this is one of the ways in which this rhetoric of complementarity plays out in Africa to everyone's, to nobody's benefit, where Chinese travelers and Chinese businesses go to Africa and they say, oh, wow, look at all this space. You would never see this much space in China. All you need is for us to come here and we'll work the land. And this is completely devoid of any understanding of customary land use patterns in Africa, where the soils are very fragile, and if you try to intensively farm it the way you did in China, it would become a dust bowl inside of a year and a half, to mention nothing of customary land rights, which are not written down anywhere, but that doesn't make it any less real. So there is framing and expectation.
Hi, this is sort of a side question, but I'm sort of hearing more about China's struggle to sort of educate the population that they currently have, and I'm wondering, along with the economic impact and the employment impact that you've both mentioned, has there been an educational impact about this growth and development as well? Well, I'm sort of going back to your mural where you're sort of showing, oh, we've got the same number of Chinese students and Mexican students going here. Are we seeing, are more Chinese students now leaving to go to Latin America as a result of this economic development?
Latin America is still not one of the more favored destinations for young Chinese people who are upwardly mobile and have opportunities to study abroad. The United States, Canada, Australia, and Western Europe are still very, very much the favored destinations. This said, China has established something on the order of 40-odd, I think it's 42, Confucius Institutes in Latin America to teach Chinese language and for cultural exchange. So that would be very interesting to study. Okay, who goes? Is there a difference in the people who go to Latin America and Africa and, say, Canada or England? You know, that's an empirical question. I just don't know. I suspect so. I suspect that it would be. What is a very interesting thing that I have not been able to touch on in this lecture, because I had to make some choices, is how Chinese perceive Latin America and Latin Americans. And it's quite interesting to see that on the whole, if you look at internet blogs, if internet blogs are any kind of representation of anything that we want to take seriously, Latin America and Latin Americans are not particularly well thought of because they're associated with underdevelopment, with instability, with poverty, and with highly skewed income distributions. Now, China's been doing a very good job, in fact, of trying to catch up with Latin America in terms of skewed income in the last 20 or so years. But in theory, they don't like that. So there's a discourse about Latin Americanization as a bad thing in the blogosphere in China. And we have a wonderful, wonderful piece in the volume from a guy by the name of Cheng Ying-hung, who is a bit older as a scholar. I mean, the poor guy ended up at Delaware State University with a 4-4 teaching load. Poor guy. But he was even a participant in, because he studied China and Cuba. And so he was one of the few people around who knew anything at all about Latin America. And he got very much involved in a debate about a play on Che Guevara. That then became the focus of a debate amongst intellectual elites within the party that ended up using Cuba as a way to discuss the turn that China had made in terms of neoliberalization and unfair, unskewed income ratios, and basically whole strategies of development. And so Cuba, in this weird way, ended up becoming this distorting, refracting mirror, reflected back on Chinese elites within the Chinese Communist Party between the more, quote, economically neoliberal group led by Jiang Zemin and a group of people within the establishment in the party collectively known as the New Left. So Latin America ends up with involved in some strange debates and being used in some strange ways within China. But by and large, what there is apathy and ignorance, because Latin America on the whole figures, I mean, there is some interest, there's more interest than there was 10 years ago, but Latin America is such a remote concern compared to Southeast Asia, India that shares a border and a history of tension, the, quote, developed Western Europe, the United States for development reasons, economic reasons, security reasons. It still is sort of not quite thought of. And I would suspect that even less is known or cared about amongst the Chinese public in general about Latin America than Africa, where there at least was this highly public diplomacy in the 60s and 70s. And anybody who went to a Chinese university would have at least known of African students studying in China. then and also now.
Do I get the last question? Is there anybody? One last question, if I may, at a very different level. There's a lot of talk about the international financial institutions and the BRICS, for example, wanting more influence in the international financial institutions. And is there any indication of the Chinese using their diplomacy in either Africa or Latin America to try to influence questions of control of the international financial institutions? I'm thinking of this particularly in the context of the World Bank presidency nominee having just happened. But in general, I'm trying to think of what foreign policy stakes they might actually have in having some more support from Latin American states. I'm not sure there is any.
Well, I'm not sure that there is that much. Because if it comes to a vote, Africa has a lot more states that can vote. Informally, again, the rhetoric is that China, India, Russia, South Africa, Brazil, you would think that there are good reasons for either China or Brazil to have more of a presence in these kinds of institutions. And there has been talk about, grumbling and so far, though, this has never come out as anything more than the blandest of official statements about encouragement of consideration of other alternatives to reflect the rising power of Asia, Africa, Latin America, the developing world. But what else would they say at a BRICS summit? I mean, what do you expect? They have to say something. And when you actually look at what has been done, I wouldn't expect any agreement between Brazil and China anytime soon, because is it going to be a Chinese or is it going to be a Brazilian? I wouldn't, when you, talking the talk about BRICS and the developing world is all very well, and it should be done, in fact, because it is reflecting something real that is happening and that should ultimately be reflected in a variety of international organizations and institutions and regimes and so forth. On the other hand, the sticky choice of who gets to be first could be a bit of a sticking point. And Dilma Rousseff is much tougher than Lula was in terms of and she's very technocratic in terms of the way she deals with things, including the Chinese. So she's pretty tough and pretty technocratic. We'll just have to see.
I think that's a good final line for the talk. We just have to see. Thank you very, very much, Dr. Strauss.
Thank you for having me.